She never wanted to deprive herself, and she would explicitly talk about that.
It's like, if I'm queen of the known universe, I'm having the fucking cake, mate. Like, sorry. Fatness is power. Wanna know how I know? Because one day when I was standing in front of the closed doors of the subway waiting to get off, and I saw a man who thought he was gonna cut me off as he tried to get on first, he learned the truth when the doors opened and I bounced his ass 3 feet to the left and went on about my black ass way. There is no way I have been eating carbs my entire life to be brushed aside by some malignant man-child, okay? But the world loves to forget about women's strength. Who were those fat female leaders who wielded power both with their bodies and their intellect? And how come nobody ever told me that Queen Victoria was fat? I mean, I've been living here for like, what, years? Nobody mentioned that? That woman loved cake and colonialism, all right? And she Victorianized the better part of the world. And how much do you want to bet that no matter how big her empire got, there was always someone like, do you think you really want to eat that? I think the saying is let them eat cake. Excuse me, I'm not the one who's about to get their head chopped off. Why are there all these fat female leaders that I either never knew existed or never knew were fat? Like the Pharaoh HATSHEPSUT or the Queen of Tonga? And why have their legacies sometimes been purposefully erased? Let's dive right in with Dr. Freya Gowrley. Dr. Freya Gowrley, thank you so much for joining me. Please share a little bit of your majesty with the rest of us.
Thank you so much, Desiree. I am an art historian, which means I look at images and objects from the past, but I'm interested in fatness and how it appears in images and objects throughout history.
Is the dearth of seeing fat figures, forms in art, in painting, in sculpture, I know it's a bit about who is making that art and the social mores of the time, but is it also to a certain extent about who is curating that art, who is collecting it? Is there a bunch of art with fat figures out there that we're never getting to see because it's not Western or conventionally attractive?
That's a really great question. And actually, our understanding of so much about history is based on what survives, right? And that is decided upon by people who collect things, by museums that decide what objects are worth preserving. Even if you're thinking about clothing, we have a lot of examples of really beautiful 18th century corsets, which are kind of very nicely constructed, but for very small bodies. And it's partly because they didn't bother collecting corsets which belong to bigger women. Yeah. The archive hides so much kind of rigorous and interesting information that may just have been lost because some old white dude decided he wasn't interested in it.
Yeah, and therefore no one else would be either, apparently, according to him. The first person I really wanted to sink my teeth into and talk to you about, Pharaoh HATSHEPSUT. What really shocked me about her was the extreme effort that people went to erase and deface her reign, her power, her, just sort of majesty after she died, right? Because she was quite a successful pharaoh.
Exactly. She was a very successful pharaoh. She was very well renowned, particularly in terms of this architectural program that she enacted, which is still celebrated today as one of the great architectural structures from that period. She revitalized the economy at this time as well. It's interesting to see the way in which other female pharaohs and leaders of Egypt, like Cleopatra, have been so valorized and recorded in history.
I read that she referred to herself as HATSHEPSUT instead of the feminine ending because it seemed to further legitimize her being pharaoh if she took on a masculine name, like she wore a fake beard. How much did just sort of generalized misogyny affect her reign as pharaoh? How much did fatphobia come into play at all?
It's difficult to know about fatphobia because in the representations we have of her, so like the carved representations, she seems relatively kind of straight-sized. When her mummy is discovered, what we have is this discourse around her, which is about, oh, well, she was diabetic. And so there's an emphasis not on the fact that she's this kind of discussed, amazing female leader, but instead it's about, oh, the state of her health, how much she might have weighed, whether she would be obese by today's standards. Yeah. There's a lot of speculation going on there. And I think that it's interesting to think about why you might speculate around a kind of female ruler in a way that there never really is that same kind of discussion of what male leaders kind of look like.
They always find ways to talk about a woman's body, which just seems a bit sort of reductive considering the scope of what she did. So I want to talk about Ruth Kelikolani, another very large leader. I know a little bit about Hawaii as an American, but basically for us, our perception of Hawaii comes to light in like the 1950s when it becomes a state.
Ruth Kelikolani is a really great way of maybe reclaiming or kind of reinvigorating some of that Hawaiian history, which so often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
She was a member of the Kamehameha family. She became the royal governor of the island, and it's really interesting because this was a time when American women didn't even have the vote, right?
I mean, and Black people weren't people. Let's get the context straight. This was definitely mid-1800s. Nobody had any rights except for, you know, white guys in wigs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, the fact that she has so much power at this time is really interesting, particularly because she was such a staunch supporter of Hawaiian traditions.
If we talk about her stature, her physicality, I mean, she's, you know, a 400-pound woman who's over 6 feet tall. I would imagine being in a Victorian corset, while I will say having worn a corset, it's much easier on a fat body because I'm like, you are nowhere near any of my organs. This is great. Push it all around, that's fine. Would she have done this because she was like, oh, this is the height of fashion everywhere in the world and I feel good or comfortable or whatever? Or do you think it would have been more like, oh, people who come here need to know that I'm the one who's the queen and who's in charge?
So it's probably partly that this is fashionable wear and she's aware of this and wants to kind of engage with that. But at the same time, it's probably also about sort of her wanting to present herself in the types of garments that a queen would wear from the time, right? If she speaks fluent English, she was presumably well aware of figures like Victoria. Maybe she even kind of identified with Victoria as well.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about who Queen Victoria was. Who does she say she is, and who does her contemporary society say she is?
So Queen Victoria, she is queen from 1837 to 1901. So she has a very long reign and one of the longest until Queen Elizabeth II, so more recently. So she sort of oversees this period of very difficult British history, but at the time was seen as Britain's emergence as this important imperial power on a global stage. But from her own diaries, we get a sense of her real kind of subjectivity. So as a child, we know that she was subjected to quite rigorous dietary restrictions. So she was given bread and milk. But then, as we know, as an older woman, she was really against restrictions of any kind. She never wanted to deprive herself, and she would explicitly talk about that.
Anyone who goes about colonizing most of the known world, to me, like, needs something. And in my head, if she started off as a young person who was told, like, you're fat, no one's probably gonna want you, you're gonna get one meal of bread and milk a day, to someone who goes, I'm never gonna deprive myself of anything ever again in her adult, powerful life, this is someone who I then can see colonizing the universe, of being like, well, why shouldn't we have that? Why shouldn't I eat all of the fruits of the world that I rule over? And people continue to tell her, like, not to have cake, you know? And it's like, if I'm queen of the known universe, I'm having the fucking cake, mate. Like, sorry.
What is interesting is this shift in body standards that happens from the sort of consumer revolution, as you mentioned, in the sort of 18th century. And then there's more stuff, more food available to eat than ever before. And so this is the first time that you get a lot of moralization around what people are eating, what is too much and what you need versus what you want. And so this is a really important time for food becoming about like willpower and, you know, not overindulging.
Because there's a surplus of it now.
Yeah, for the first time. And so across that century, you have this increasing anxiety around bodies and bodies that maybe are gaining weight. And until you get to this point where this extreme kind of thinness becomes the ideal beauty standard. So the idea that you would look tubercular, like you had tuberculosis, you would be very lithe and slim, you would be very pale and have rosy cheeks. So it is interesting that Victoria then gains a lot of weight. And I guess she sort of stands out in an age when women were expected to be very thin.
I guess what I'll say that I just find the most inspiring and joy-making about Queen Victoria is that she kind of was a rebel and bucked what everybody else told her, tradition and outside information. She was just sort of like, I'm going to eat what I want, I won't be denied, and without me, you wouldn't have a flippant empire, so deal with it. Like, there is something very powerful as a woman who has done that much when you're receiving all of that input about what you need to be doing to be perfect, to say, oh, no, actually, what you're gonna do is shut the hell up. I want to talk about someone a little bit more modern, who is the Queen of Tonga, who was not a figure that I was aware of until quite recently. The Queen of Tonga was gorgeous and like 6'3", a very heavy-set woman, but I think, you know, in Tonga, that is the standard of beauty, and that is just sort of the build. What can you tell us about the Queen of Tonga?
Her name was Salote Tupu III, and she was queen from 1918 until 1965, so a 48-year reign. So like Victoria, a very long reign and one of the longest for a Tongan monarch at the time. So she was very well loved and well regarded within her society. She was part of a dynasty that had existed in Tonga since the 1600s. So a very long, kind of powerful line. So again, it's surprising that we don't know more about her given her importance for Tonga.
Do you get the sense from her that anything to do with body image or shaming or fatphobia at all touched her in any way?
In Tongan culture, larger women are considered to be sexy, and it's a very much a kind of a good quality for someone to have. So it's quite a different kind of culture that she existed in, and I don't think her weight ever held her back.
All of these women that we've talked about today had quite impactful, impressive, long-ranging sort of positions of power. We're talking about this sort of fatness and power, right, coming together. And there is something implicitly powerful, not only about the stature, but about the like, I don't give a damn what you think-ness of it. What can you say about size and power, political power, throughout history?
The intersection between the two things is clearly very complex, but also fascinating. And I think that the point you made about the fact that they're monarchs is also revealing, right? These are women who have hereditary power, who assume the thrones along long established lines. And I think when we think about maybe elected officials today,
it's a little different.
As much kind of fat representation. Obviously, someone great like Stacey Abrams is really one amongst not many fat women that I can think of who are in power.
And has still faced fat shaming, even though she's completely transformed the electorate of not only the state of Georgia, but America in general.
Yes, which is just so telling, isn't it? It's already such a kind of putting you on the back foot to be a woman, so let alone a kind of fat woman, let alone a woman of color, and kind of like the other monarchs that we've spoken about, just this incredible sense of self-assuredness, right? Being very sort of in command and not really worried about what anyone else thinks of them. I feel like that's been the theme of what we've talked about today.
Yeah, is that fat people in power don't really care what you think about them or their bodies, particularly fat women. By the time they've gotten to being in power, like, you really can't say anything but yes, ma'am. To me, I feel like empowered in a body like this. I feel like I can do a lot of things that other people can't do, and I face a bit fewer dangers than maybe a straight-sized woman does because I fight back. And so I was drawn very much to this subject to see how that physical sense of self and of power and grounding can impact what you bring to a larger society.
I think maybe jumping off from this idea of of fatness and its relation to power. We often talk about fatness in terms of lack of power, right? But we often kind of think about fat individuals as someone who are worthy of maybe like sadness or kind of our sympathies, right? Because they're like fat and they get teased and sort of made fun of and all of these kinds of things. So actually it's really empowering to kind of flip that narrative and to think about fatness and power and positive representations of fat individuals throughout history, rather than just those who were kind of maligned and disregarded for being fat. So there is something really empowering, I think, about retelling these stories.
Absolutely. Dr. Freya Gowrley, thank you so much for coming and letting us know a little bit more about our fat power in history and in the universe. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you so much for having me. I've had a really great time.
If you want to watch more of these videos, subscribe to my channel.